Right, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you had a good lunch. My name is Sophie Robinson-Tillett. I'm an associate here at Oxford University's Public and Third Sector Academy for Sustainable Finance. I'm not used to saying the full name. And I'm also a journalist. I'm a contributing editor at Investment and Pensions Europe and the editor of Real Economy Progress. And I spend all my time writing about sustainable finance and have done for the last 10 or 12 years or whatever. And I am very excited. I say very excited. I'm very pleased that we are going to be discussing the EU's current deregulation agenda. Today it's my favourite topic, it's also my least favourite topic, but it is something that is really, really important. We're going to be looking at what it means for sustainable finance around the world. We're not going to do a deep dive on the EU Omnibus for anyone who's excited about the possibility that we may do that. We're not going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of each piece of regulation, but we will be talking about the Omnibus. We'll also be talking about the state of broader green policy in Europe and whether deregulation is reaching those fields as well. We'll discuss if all of that is influencing regulatory sentiment elsewhere in the world, and ultimately what all of it means for investors in terms of asset allocation and risk management and green strategies and all of that good stuff. To do that, we've got some fantastic speakers. I'm very pleased to introduce James Alexander, Chief Executive of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, over on the end there. Martin Stavenhagen, Policy Specialist in Climate and Transition at the Principles for Responsible Investment, based from Berlin. And Barbara Svan, CEO of Ontario University Pension Plan over in Canada, who's come to join us. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And we have a nice global audience and a nice global panel, so that's great. We are also supposed to have an omnibus specialist on the panel, but unfortunately he had a last-minute issue getting here, so you're stuck with me explaining what's what. I want to start at the beginning when it comes to the EU omnibus, because I think it's important to anchor this in its historical and political context a little bit. A lot of the time the conversation about the EU omnibus is very granular, but I do think that there is a starting point. Before I go on, I'll ask you to ask questions as we go, so don't wait until the end. If you have a question, stick your hand up, we'll try and get to it as we go. But just a rough show of hands, who here lives and breathes EU omnibus developments at the moment? Okay, sorry about that. Who here's got a rough sense of what's going on, but not? Okay, great. And who here has managed to make good life choices and not very clear on the... No good life choices in the whole room? Okay, shame. Well, we'll start at the basics, which is that 2018-19, the EU decides it wants to do sustainable finance regulation. There's there's four real reasons for this. The first is that it is worried about China becoming the leader in green finance standards, and it doesn't want to follow on behind, so it wants to become a leader there. There's also the fact that these prudential voices, central banks and NGFS and so on, talking about the risk of climate to financial stability. Obviously, there's the fact that the EU has just signed up to the Paris Agreement at that point and legally ratified it, and they need to shift the economy in order to meet that commitment. And then there's this quieter thing going on, which is that Brexit has just happened, and there is a growing sense in Brussels that they need to reconnect both the financial system and the political system with the people who it's supposed to represent. So there's a push to try and get money to behave in a way that reflects people's values. So in order to deal with all of these things, the Commission puts together 20 people and says, go away and come up with what we need to do. And the result of those recommendations were a slew of sustainable finance regulation. The stuff that we're talking about really when we come to the omnibus is the taxonomy regulation, that list of green business activities that are supportive of the EU's climate objectives, and then an additional requirement for companies and investors to disclose how their activities and their investments and their spending stacks up against that list of green activities. CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the sequel to the non-financial reporting directive, a much tougher, more expansive set of mandatory requirements for sustainability disclosures, underpinned by some standards called ESRS. And, well, those are the two that come out, and then you've got other things that satellite them, the SFDR and various other things which are also being caught up in this deregulation agenda, but not through the omnibus. If you flip forward, you then got the Green Deal that we're going to talk about a little bit later, and you've got the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is that one law which says, actually, we're going to go beyond transparency and we're going to start to ask you for behavioural change. We're going to hold you as companies accountable for breaches of environmental and social breaches in your business supply chains, based on the UNGPs. So that then came in, and then you have a whole new political circumstance. Last year, EU elections, shift to the right. This tidal wave of rules that's been coming in is very unpopular with companies, it's very unpopular with some investors. And then there's an election where things move to the right, there's national elections, there's a lot of pressure on the European Commission to deal with this, and there's the fact that the EU is struggling to compete with Asia and the US. And so at the end of last year, the Commission commits to cut by 25%, just 25 to 30%, Ursula von der Leyen says, we're going to reduce the reporting requirements. And they're going to do this through something called an omnibus, which is a single law that changes more than one existing law. So that's what the omnibus is. Now, of course, I think you probably all know, we're going way beyond 20, 30% in what's being proposed at the moment. So we're in the midst of political negotiations right now. They're not expected to finish until next year. But at the moment, it looks like we're closer to, for the CSRD, closer to an 80% reduction. That's a combination of reducing the number of companies very significantly who have to disclose anything, and then through secondary legislation disclosing, changing what the remaining companies have to disclose. The taxonomy for financial institutions, last week there was a rule passed that confirmed that financial institutions will have about 90% of their data points removed from the regulation, and companies will have 60% or something like that. So again, huge reductions. We don't know quite what the scope of the taxonomy reduction is going to be, but there's another set coming. And CS3D, that due diligence rule, is having, I think, fair to say, all of its teeth pulled out one by one. No civil liability regime. Importantly, no transition plan requirements under some of the proposals that are being put forward at the moment. And Council wants it to apply only to companies with more than 5,000 employees. So you can imagine how small it will end up being if that does go through. Some of this has already happened. There are already some delays. Importantly, last week, with the Corporate Reporting Sustainability Directive, the companies already reporting to the market and telling investors about their sustainability performance will not have to do what they were supposed to have to do next year, which is explain the financial implications of climate change on their businesses. And they will also not have to disclose a whole load of other stuff that they were going to have to disclose last year. Businesses that were supposed to come in next year for the first time have a 2-year delay on them now while this all gets sorted out. So big reductions, huge delays, possibly quite toothless regulation in some parts at the end of it. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the omnibus, and it's a lot of the conversation around the deregulation agenda. But it is not all that's going on in Europe, is it, Martin? I mean, there's things outside of these 2 or 3 files that dominate the public conversation. Somebody said to me earlier, I wish I could turn off the omnibus comments on my LinkedIn so I don't have to see any more about it. And apologies, because I'm sure a few of those have come from me. But there's a whole world outside the omnibus that we should talk about to put this in its context. Can you tell us whether deregulation is a broader EU thing on green, or whether other green policies are staying put?
Yeah, thank you. And that's it's good to be here on the panel, and it's a very interesting and very big question as well. Well, if we look at the larger picture of climate and sustainability policy in the EU, back from the EU Green Deal, but maybe a bit later as well, you have the EU Climate Law from 2021, which is really groundbreaking legislation, and also sets the climate neutrality target, mandatory climate neutrality target in the EU by 2050, which is domestic, by the way, domestic. So net zero by 2050, and also like a 2030 climate target of reducing emissions by 55%. So yes, now this was 2019, now we have like the new commission, the new 5-year period, and it has been met with a lot of backlash and a lot of simplification. So the deregulation agenda has become much more prominent. I think one of the reports, or one of the pieces of information that was part of that, was the Draghi report back in September, very influential, and also kind of set the priorities for Ursula von der Leyen's new commission and the strategic agenda of the EU. One key message is that the EU would need 750 to 800 billion euros of investment till 2030 alone for the net zero agenda and the net zero transition. And then earlier this year, you have the Clean Industrial Deal as this kind of key point of legislation. And by the way, this proposal was published right on the same day, right next to the omnibus proposal, right? So you have this shift to from a climate agenda to a competitiveness agenda. And the 2040 target is a little bit part of that as well. Maybe we'll come to that. The Clean Industrial Deal itself doesn't have a climate target. They say that the proposed target for the Clean Industrial Deal should be 90%, but there was no official proposal yet. And the proposal for this 90% came just 2 weeks ago from the Commission, and maybe one can go a little bit into the intricacies and so on, because it's not like a straight 90%, but part of that could also be done by offsets from other countries, basically outsourcing some of the domestic emission reductions to other countries through international carbon credits. There's a lot of flexibilities built in there, and there's some uncertainty of which part of this 2040 target will actually be implemented. So far, it's just the proposal from the Commission, but there's no agreement yet in the negotiations with the Council, the Member States, and the Parliament.
And that's 90% by 2040?
That is 90% by 2040, and what is interesting to know is there's something called National Energy and Climate Plans. It's another mandatory requirement from EU states, from the Climate Governance Regulation. There's a lot of different pieces that all fit together. But these National Energy and Climate Plans look at what each country, each EU member state's trajectory is, what their plans are. There's some things that can be improved there. But according to these NECPs, the EU is already on track for 54% reductions by 2030. The goal is 55%. So the feasibility is there. There are plans that are going towards these goals for 2030, which is already part of the climate law, which is already mandatory. And now the idea is like to keep that momentum going and go to 2040 and reach the minus 90%. And maybe one more word on the regulatory backlash. So yes, my LinkedIn is full of omnibus as well. But this kind of regulatory omnibus on disclosure and reporting is just the first one in this whole set of omnibus, proposed omnibus legislation going forward. And from my perspective of the entire net zero transition, climate agenda, which is now the competitiveness agenda as well for the EU, I think some other things next to due diligence and reporting, some of the other legislation which is also important going forward would be the deforestation regulation, also like a groundbreaking piece of legislation for due diligence specifically for deforestation supply chains. You have the methane regulation, also like through pressures, for example, from the US, which would have certain kind of requirements for fossil fuel companies, and there's like some kind of negotiation going on there. So there's a whole broad range of regulation that is under attack, or at least being negotiated, and would have to be in place to reach the 90% climate target and also the climate neutrality target of the EU climate law.
Right. Okay. And the EU deforestation regulation, they've just pushed for that to be added to an omnibus package, haven't they? Or it's a simplification. Batteries under the carbon border adjustment mechanism reduced by 90%, although that seems to be more popular. But so that, as you say, there's this whole series of laws that are also being deregulated. Is there any reason to be hopeful?
Yeah, no, there is. I mean, I would start with the hopeful part and then go into all the buts, but we can do it the other way around. I think the climate law is groundbreaking, and it's the first continent that says we want to be climate neutral by 2050. The whole Fit for 55 package, all the legislation that went forward to reach the 2030 target, has been hard fought over. It also shows that it now being, there's a certain pushback against it, does show how relevant it is, if you want to put it that way. I already mentioned that the EU seems, if things go the way they are supposed to go, they seem to be on track for the 2030 target. And personally, I think combining and connecting the climate agenda with the competitiveness agenda, saying that competitiveness is to be decarbonizing your industry to make it more globally competitive on the market. Like, be a leader in the clean tech sector, for example, be more innovative, invest in the circular economy, become more resource independent, and become like a leader in all the technologies and all the infrastructure for the emerging net zero economy is beneficial. And all of the legislation actually tries to incentivize companies to see that.
Now, I want to come back to the question of competitiveness a bit later on. Before we find out what's going on in the rest of the world, just on this EU section, has anyone got any questions before we move over to what's going on in the UK? Anything that's come up? Jakob?
The balance between
The shift in priorities and actually wanting to do something different or achieve different goals versus a revolt against fully written rules of legal play.
So is this the EU saying these rules don't work and aren't going to get us where we need to go, or is it saying we want to go somewhere else now, we wanted to, yeah?
That's a really good question, because I think there are proponents on both sides. I think there are those private sector actors, but not just the private sector, not at all, also like all the member states, society, that do see, okay, we actually do agree on the goal, we do agree on the climate neutrality, we agree on becoming greener, but also more social, and we want to like find the best way to do that. How much of that should be legislated? How much transparency and data sharing do we need for that? How much is the burden of providing this information and so on? We can talk about that and find the best kind of solution, informed by impact assessments, informed by experts. And there's other actors as well who I believe would prefer flexibility not only in the measures, but also in the actual targets. There are voices that say these climate neutrality targets or these decarbonization targets are actually an inherent risk or danger to our economic development. But sometimes the language of this burden is too big or we need less regulations, like wanting a different goal is kind of in there but not explicitly mentioned. So I think there's both good faith proponents and there's those that disagree on the actual targets and objectives, but go through this is too much regulation and let's see where it goes kind of route.
Yeah, I think a great case in point on that is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is not a reporting requirement, but is being kind of shoehorned in. It's a bit of a sort of Trojan horse thing where it's being added in as a burden to reporting when it isn't. But I think, yeah, there's a mix.
It's also worth adding that I think there's going to be 9 omnibuses in total. So the one that we know of as the omnibus is the first of multi that are going to be in different sectors. So I think to your point, it is a big chunk of the objective is deregulation and simplification and competitiveness rather than necessarily moving away from the agenda per se. But different parts of the Parliament will have different views on that. And the right of the Parliament, I think, has just taken on a major reporting role in the climate piece. And that could therefore make it more kind of anti-climate agenda focused rather than anti-regulation focused.
Yeah, that was another plot twist, wasn't it? They gave the negotiating file to the far right in Parliament for the 2040 climate target. So that took everyone by surprise last week and may mean that there's some interventions there that might not have made it in otherwise. So yeah, interesting.
And a motion put forward by the Greens to sort of fast track the process so the far right couldn't get too much grip of it was defeated as well. So.
Yeah. Yes. It's not boring at the moment in the EU. What's it like in the UK? James?
Oh well, the UK is not boring either. Similarly to the EU, the UK is focusing on what the EU calls competitiveness, which doesn't mean anything. The UK calls it jobs and growth, which I think resonates more effectively, perhaps with an electorate. And I think for the first few months of this new government, the jobs and growth narrative was so strong that the sense was, if anybody came here wanting to invest in absolutely anything, fracking, whatever, they'd be welcome with open arms, and the Chancellor would invite them in and make everything possible. I think that's toned down a little bit now, and actually we've been pushing the narrative for a really long time that the future of the UK economy must be a sustainable economy. That is how we become fit for the future and how we win the kind of sustainability transition, which is obviously happening. We've got a question already. Do you want to ask it right now?
Does it work?
Yeah.
My question is, there's certain regulations that the EU has to meet on an international level. And so when you make a commitment on an international level, you then have to show that you are actually working towards that commitment in a lawful manner, right? So you are meeting the commitment on a yearly basis. And in order to do that, you have to provide regulations that allow you to do that. So if I don't provide regulations that put me on that pathway, then technically I'm violating international law.
And you're talking about climate commitments when you say a global, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got no lawyers up here, but I don't know if anyone has a view on that immediately, or if we can bring it into our conversation later.
I think let's bring it into conversation, but there's one thing I'd say on that is there was something in the US Senate that was going to be a really interesting test of that. I think it's been dropped, but it was basically going to fine companies $1 million for complying with EU extraterritorial regulation. And that was, I think it's been dropped, which I'm obviously pleased about mostly, but from a kind of just intellectual curiosity perspective, I was really intrigued to see what would happen with that. And I think certainly the US is going to test the extraterritoriality elements of the EU video.
But this specifically applies to the EU, right? So the way that we would interpret the law is I cannot pass laws that are in violation with international law, right?
I guess.
Yeah.
It's typically the way that it would work.
What's the international law that you're referring to that might be breached?
They signed on to the Paris Agreement, correct?
Yeah, I think the EU climate law is even stronger than Paris commitments because it's direct. It's not international law. It's direct EU law that all EU countries have agreed to become climate neutral by 2050, so net zero by 2050. So that in itself, I mean, what a 1.5 degree pathway is still being debated scientifically. But like the climate neutrality by 2050, I'm not against the 1.5, on the contrary, I'm completely in agreement with it. But the EU climate law itself already commits every country to become climate neutral by 2050. The question is, what countries are debating is how to actually get there. And in the law it says minus 55% emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050, and what should be the interim 2040 target in order to get from the minus 55 to net zero by 2050. And I think in comparison to a lot of other countries, the EU is trying to have these interim targets to keep itself accountable to the actual pathway to getting to net zero. But because of that, I think there's so much pushback and negotiation in the EU because that's a big job that they have committed themselves to do. I don't know if that answers your question.
The Paris Agreement very clearly calls out that we should be using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which says since 2011 that they need to report on their Scope 1, their Scope 2, and all 15 categories of Scope 3, period. Anyone that signs onto it. Next, there's human rights laws. right? And the human rights laws very clearly say that we need to protect the life of our citizens. That is international law. So if I pass national laws and they are in violation of international laws, that is a violation of international law.
What law are you saying is in contravention of these? I can see that they're not supportive necessarily, but which ones are
So the omnibus, the latest omnibus recommendations are actually, from what I'm seeing, in violation to those laws.
I think the Commission would argue that because the omnibus that we're talking about relates to transparency, and Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is the only one that doesn't relate to transparency, and that is kind of codifying the UNGPs, which the EU would say they already uphold, that's a different conversation, but in terms of passing a law, I suspect they would say, because it doesn't force behavioural change, the laws that we're introducing don't counter the human rights laws, they simply don't reinforce them the way that we were going to reinforce them by actually having a civil liability regime that punishes companies for doing it, but they still kind of have they're signed up to the UNGPs and all the rest of it. I take your point that it's very frustrating, but I suspect, I don't know if anyone else has seen any legal pursuits on this.
I'm obviously not an international lawyer, but my understanding of the Paris Agreement is the nature of it is built around nationally determined contributions, and that is that each country, or in the case of the EU, each bloc gets to create its own pathway to getting to the things it has agreed, and that there's limited sanctions that exist around not doing that, which is the problem with a lot of international law. But do you mind if I keep going with the UK update?
You go for it, yeah.
The UK is focusing on jobs and growth, similarly to the EU, and I think that's a significant political decision by this government. Now, we have obviously pushed them to look at the sustainable economy as being like core to that, and that has been played out now, I think. And if you look at the recent industrial strategy, and the spending review as well in the UK, they do major on the sustainable economy. And in fact, in the spending review, we put together sort of 2 pages of different quotes that we were going to put out into the media for the government cutting all the things that we thought they were going to cut, and actually we didn't need to use any of them because nothing got cut. Does that mean we're going fast enough to move forward? No, we need to probably go faster, but it does mean that we're not going backwards, which is positive. In terms of financial services regulation, obviously that same narrative has been flowing through that in terms of jobs and growth. The government's put a target of cutting regulation by 25%. Don't actually know how you measure that or what that means, but certainly that means that is the lens with which regulation is being looked at, and all the regulators have been given an objective to focus on growth, albeit with an additional objective around net zero and playing their part to achieve the UK's net zero 2050 commitment. So we are moving forward with regulation. We have the sustainability disclosure requirements, which is the UK's equivalent of the SFDR. When I say equivalent, it's not exactly the same in any means. I was on the working group for it. The first question that we were asked was, should we just replicate what the EU's done? And there was a resounding no, because there is a view that the SFDR has created fund labels by accident, and everybody hears about Article 8, Article 9, but that was never meant to be a label. And in fact, the EU has been quite naively shocked by the extent to which that has become a label. And so we have created in the UK a specific label framework for funds, and that is sustainability focus, sustainability improvers, which is kind of transition funds as well, and then impact investing around sustainability. And then tied to that is a new anti-greenwashing rule, which we think is really important. And what's interesting about the disclosure regulations for the UK is that they focus on investor protection, or they're not there in order to get more assets to be invested sustainably. That is not the policy goal. The policy goal is investor protection, which of course is a core, particularly retail investor protection, which is a core objective of the regulator at the very kind of heart of what they do. And I think that made it easier to get through, actually, and it meant that there was when this was scrutinized in the Parliament and media, that investor protection piece or consumer protection piece was front and center of how the government was looking at this. And I think that's really important to remember. One of the challenges of the SDR is something that we initially thought, I think, was going to be very positive, which is a broadly principles-based piece of regulation. So whereas the EU regulation broadly puts things on a railway track and you can't kind of go left or right, you just follow that track, the idea of the UK regs on sustainability disclosures was to build a fence and you can kind of do what you like in the middle of the fence. Now in principle that sounds great. In practice what that led to was the fund authorizations team at the FCA not really being clear how to approve funds with the label inside this fence. And so that's led to a very complex and at times very frustrating approvals process over the last 12 months or so. But we now have over 120 funds, I think, with the label, which is positive. I think if you're going to compare it to an EU label, it would be probably closer to Article 9 than Article 8. And we're quite excited to see these labels coming onto market. Time will tell how much financial advisors are aware of what these labels are, and therefore whether they start to sell. And I think that's going to be an interesting piece. We are currently seeing the government pushing forwards with consultations on 2 other major pieces of corporate disclosure regulation, which I think for us is really important, and that pretty much closes the gap for regulation in the UK. So that is transition plans and then ISSB adoption. So the UK has decided to move forwards with something less similar to the European sustainability reporting framework and closer to the ISSB. I think that will then be the UK joining a number of other countries, Japan, I think Singapore perhaps, in adopting ISSB. It's something very similar. They've had a working group looking at how to convert ISSB into UK law, and that's now being consulted on. And at the same time, there's a consultation on assurance and audit for firms that are making these sustainability disclosures under ISSB. With transition plans, this links back to a manifesto commitment that the Labour Party made. They wanted, and it was a really forward-pushing manifesto commitment, 1.5 degree aligned transition plans mandatory for all regulated financial services firms and all large companies. That's going to be hard, I think, for the government to enact. I think it might probably end up being comply or explain for larger firms, hopefully public and private larger firms, probably looking at net zero rather than 1.5. But I think it's going to be interesting to see, and we would obviously be pushing for that to be mandatory in due course. What is not being enacted in the UK is a green taxonomy. And in fact, the Chancellor confirmed last night that that's not happening. And I have to tell you, having been on the taxonomy working group for 2.5 years, I can tell you how frustrating that is. But I asked my media person to write me a quote that expressed mild disappointment, because we've been trying to, although we support in principle the idea of a taxonomy, we also recognize the politics that are happening and the deregulatory politics and the politics of growth. And we figured that the government probably didn't have a political window big enough to put transition plans, ISSB, and the green taxonomy into. And so on that basis, if we are to put these things in priority order, transition plans and ISSB are way higher on the priority list than a UK green taxonomy, particularly because a lot of UK companies are already going to be caught by the EU green taxonomy anyway, albeit that there are challenges with that taxonomy. And in fact, not all the work that we did on the green taxonomy group has gone to waste, because I think a number of companies have, in fact, decided, a number of countries have adopted some of the recommendations that we made. Australia, for example, is moving forward with the taxonomy that looks very similar to what we would have proposed had we had one. And this all of this comes back to the UK wanting to be the green finance capital of the world. The green economy in the UK grew by 10% last year, one of the fastest growing areas of the economy, and the government seeing that and seeing the opportunity to create growth through becoming more sustainable, and sustainable finance is an absolutely central part of the UK's green economy. And in that light, transition finance is another major priority for the UK government. I think, you know, if we can become a sort of hub for transition finance, for helping companies across the world, not just in the UK, to transition from a financial perspective. I think that will hold the UK in really good stead. And then finally, just to say that we've pivoted slightly away from the regulatory agenda at UKSIF. We've been pushing on that for 25 years, and we're kind of nearing the end of the journey. The question, I suppose, that we're asking ourselves is that delivering the huge amount of capital movement that we expected this agenda to lead to when we embarked on it? Now, it's clearly undeniably important that we have the disclosures. It's absolutely essential that investors have the information they need to make well-informed decisions that incorporate sustainability factors and dimensions, but it's not in itself sufficient to move capital at the scale we need to move it, at the speed we need to move it. And so we're now thinking about, well, how do we help, from a UK perspective, make sure that there are things to invest in? Once you've thought about this capital being available, this capital looking for things that are more sustainable, there aren't enough things to invest in, so then we're looking at the practical on-the-ground barriers that are stopping that investment. So that planning permission. It can take 10 years to get planning permission for a wind farm in the UK, 13 years to get it connected to the grid, and on top of that, there's increasingly lack of confidence of investors that the policy that underpins all this is going to stand the test of time. So again, giving investors confidence in all of this stuff. So curiously, that means that we're calling for a little bit more regulation on financial services, things like the transition plans and ISSB, but arguably slight deregulation on things like planning rules to make it easier for sustainable things to move forward with fewer objections, which I don't think is intellectually inconsistent, but is somewhat challenging to explain. And then the final thing I would say is that there's a lot of companies out there that I think are and this is not just in the UK, but a global thing, that are beginning to wonder why they're putting all this effort into corporate disclosures, and this, which obviously is not cheap, when they don't know how it's being used. Is it just it's filling in this spreadsheet that goes into a black hole? And I think it's really, really important that as an investor community, we start to make the case for why these disclosures are necessary and important for decision making.
Yes, and indeed from a policy perspective as well, because I think that quite a few people would like to see these disclosures linked up with some incentives. We wrote a piece a few weeks ago about companies being very frustrated about having disclosed all this stuff, and they said, investors have been telling us to do it for years, we gave it, and we haven't heard a thing from anyone since, and we know they've not read any of it. So I think there is this bedding down. But it's an interesting dance between the EU and the UK, because the EU kind of stepped up as a leader in the disclosure stuff and the taxonomy and so on, and indeed transition plans, and then it's pulling back the last few weeks. As you say, the UK has moved forward with its mandatory disclosures after years of people being like, what's going on, guys? You've kind of gone quiet on it. So this is renewed hope, if hope is the right word, for mandatory sustainability disclosures, and a bit more clarity on the taxonomy than there has been. Still to play for in terms of leadership, and a focus on real economy policy, I think, on both sides of the channel. What does it look like in Canada? Because Canada's sort of had a quiet leadership position or a willing but more complicated situation. And I know that there have been some moves lately, Barb, that have nodded to some of the stuff that's going on in the UK, in the EU and US. How influential is it, and what's it like in Canada?
So maybe just a little context of why I'm here on the panel is, in addition to my role in running a pension plan, and I've been in pensions for about 30 years, and I was at a large pension plan for about 25. I was part of the Canadian equivalent of the expert panel on sustainable finance back in 2018, 2019, and then the follow-on efforts that I'll talk about. So if we start around 2018, this panel was chaired by Tiff Macklin, who's now the governor of the Bank of Canada, a gentleman who's a board member of RBC, myself, and a lawyer who works for another large Canadian pension plan. So it was a small but mighty group. And we called out that Canada, a little bit different than Europe and the UK. It's a big country, it's a big landmass. We produce a lot of emissions per capita. Canada is very complicated from a regulatory point of view. It's federated, which means a lot of the powers are with the province. So when you look to implement a lot of the things that you spoke about, you actually have to go province by province. But the one thing we do have, and what we noticed, was that we have a very concentrated financial sector. So you literally can put about 25 to 30 CEOs in a room, and you probably have 90% of the financial system. You can count more regulators than that, right? So a bit to the strategy of how we approached it. The underlying theme is how influential has the EU. We've always looked at the EU as the gold standard of, they went through a very extensive process, but there was also that was a little heavy, that wasn't focused on competition. It wouldn't fly culturally in Canada if we went to that level of detail or that level of reporting. And so we had to figure out the balance. I think in some context from the Canadian companies, 77-ish% of our trade is with the US. Right? So you can imagine recently. Right? A lot of our largest companies are cross-listed on the US exchange. Right? So when you do any of these panels, the first question you always get is, what is the US doing? Right? Because that is where most of the companies have to put, they have one foot in each area because they run operations in Canada, they run operations in the US. So since 2018 to 2019, we came out with this report. We actually did take 25 CEOs and put them in a group called the Sustainable Finance Action Council. And we actually had CEO level involvement or someone into the CEO involvement across these financial institutions. And it included banks, pension plans, insurers, as well as the official sector. So think of the main financial regulator, short form is OSFI, Bank of Canada representatives, and said, what are those foundational elements that we actually need to do to make sustainable finance mainstream? And not surprisingly, it was data, disclosure, taxonomy, and then we built in a work stream around blended finance, which actually got the most energy because it was about opportunities, but it built off the other elements of the foundation. So we made these recommendations. They were pretty much done by 2024. We were sitting in Ottawa last year, and the Prime Minister actually announced that he was going to implement disclosure in the way that the federal government can, which was through the Canadian Business Corporation Act, impacting the largest private companies in Canada, which there are a lot of, and actually implementing a green and transition taxonomy. And he actually made a joke that the only thing wrong with the taxonomy, it had the word tax in it. Right? So, we were like, oh my God, we're finally actually moving forward. At this point, we're now 6 years in, right? So nothing is moving too quickly in Canada either. So they tried to rebrand taxonomy as sustainable investment guidelines. I would say the one bright light in terms of things actually moving quicker in Canada is the main financial regulator, OSFI. And they came out with something called B15, which is for the largest financial institutions in Canada, which is mainly banks and insurers, that they have to do the reporting aligned with ISSB, and they need to start disclosing to the regulator the risks around climate change. And so it's actually seen from the investor community as quite a good guideline in terms of helping understand where we are in our maturity of managing climate risk, right? So we get to this point, I'm not sure if you follow any Canadian politics, but the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance basically pulled the plug on the Trudeau government, and things just went quiet. Right? We are now into, who's going to be the next Liberal leader, knowing that there will be an election. We were all, from a sustainable finance perspective, we knew that the next government, if it was a Conservative government, would not put a lot of the things in place. So we were trying to think about how to make this resilient. Somebody called Trump comes in, causes complete and utter turmoil in Canada. Right? Think of it, we are 3/4 of our trade goes to the US. And then when there is a survey, and the biggest trade item is energy. And if you survey Americans, they will first say that they're energy independent, which is wrong. And then when you ask the group that actually answered that correctly, who is your biggest trading partner for energy, they will say Saudi Arabia over Canada. So a lot of the things that Trump is doing, is enabled by the fact that people don't clearly have the facts in terms of what role Canada has. And then if you look at Canada, most of the trade goes north-south, not east-west through Canada. So everything was built for north-south trade. I would say the one bright light is everyone knows Mark Carney in this room. That probably enabled him to become the Prime Minister of Canada. So we can at least say our Prime Minister understands the importance of aligning dollars and what is actually needed to align those dollars. So now we move to uncertainty. So the agenda is completely on how do we manage through these tariffs, concerns about other changes, but also at the same time last year. So you have this big concern around the US. The government came out with a greenwashing bill. It's called C-59. It was poorly worded. They just said under business activity, you shouldn't be doing greenwashing. They didn't define business activity. So it now includes even organizations like my own in terms of managing pension plans for the university sector, and has encompassed corporate disclosure. So you've seen a massive pullback in disclosure because of C-59. The other challenge you have in C-59 is they put in a right of private action. And I kid you not, 6 individuals, so basically the couple front rows here, can put in a claim that you made a greenwashing claim as long as you said, written or verbal, something incorrect to one person. And the fine is up to 3% of your revenues. And so then they went to the Competition Bureau and said, you need to put some rules around this. Competition Bureau said, you know what, we're gonna let the courts decide. So now you have every corporation in Canada saying they don't want to be the case study for the courts. So the lawyers have gone through all our disclosures. You've seen different companies react to different levels of extents. Some have even pulled off historical disclosures right in the time where we should be encouraging more disclosure and providing more safe harbors. And this is an environment where recently, maybe a small bright light, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board actually accepted ISSB and announced they will put mandatory S1, S2, which is what the investors in Canada have been calling for. Align with ISSB. We think that is a good first step in disclosure. Do you have any idea to implement in Canada ISSB, CSSB, S1, S2, how many bodies actually have to put it in place? It is over 30. So you have the main regulator, you have security commissions are by province, so you have 10 plus 3 territories. You have to change every business act, so every province, every territory, the federal one, and to impact pension plans and other financial institutions, even provincially, I am regulated provincially, so you have to go get those changed. So it is not, there's no belief this would happen quickly, but having, I think your reference to the CSA, the Canadian Securities Administration, which brings all these groups, the security regulators together, and the other shoe dropped when they said, we're just gonna pause. It wasn't delayed by 2 years, it wasn't, we'll reevaluate next year. It was, we are just gonna hit pause, is the wording. So you can imagine that investors are quite concerned about this, but meanwhile, they're fearful to speak out because you have some of them with huge operations in the US. You have others that are worried about C-59. And so a lot of the things that are happening are, I would say, happening quietly in terms of how do we actually put this back together, right? It felt like the Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. Like, how do we actually start and get back to the momentum? And just to understand where Canadian companies are, I chair something called Climate Engagement Canada, which is the equivalent of Climate Action 100 Plus in Canada. So we engage with the top 40 emitters in Canada. When you look at those companies and where they are at, they're not bad on board oversight. They're very comparable with their global peers. Actually, oddly enough, they are comparable on disclosure if you count part marks. But if you look at full marks, they're earlier in the journey. But things like commitments, short-term targets, long-term targets, decarbonization strategies, they are behind their global peers, many years behind their global peers. And then if you look at them trying to articulate CapEx, which would be my question to the folks that decided not to have a UK taxonomy, most of them cannot articulate if their CapEx is aligned to the transition because there is no taxonomy in Canada and so much of it is transition. So it's pretty much zero. Any company really cannot do that today in Canada. So when you think of investors who ultimately will be in these labeled funds, they will have a real challenge in investing into these companies. They're equally as bad on, I would say, lobbying and policy advocacy as their global peers too. There's kind of a belief that in Canada they're not. They're just as bad in terms of marks. So in terms of Canada, you find that actually in the US, if you look at data now from 2003, there's many more companies that actually made science-based target initiative commitments. It's probably at 34% that have SBT commitments, with another, call it 15, so almost half with commitments. Where in Canada, the equivalent number is a quarter, with half of that maybe doing science-based. So just generally, Canada is behind. With the recent Trump and C-59, it has put an absolute chilling effect. The federal government is rightfully worried about trade issues, rightfully worried about, Canada's healthiness around the balance sheet. And there's many perspectives around types of policies that we actually need. And one of the things that they want to do is increase trade with all the other parts of the world. And with the most part, they've all moved to mandatory disclosure, and most now, except for the UK, have moved forward with taxonomies, which, by the way, there's probably now about 60 of them in the world. And there's actually softwares coming out to, funded by groups like the Singapore Monetary Authority to help people translate between them. And so it is going to get better.
I just want to, because you're right, there is this kind of patchwork of all of these different regs, and as you say, there's some stuff that Canada was moving forward on in terms of ISSB that they've paused on, and they cited when they did that the kind of issues around global developments in the States, but also in Europe, that there is this idea that Canada can't be the first one out while everyone else is pulling back. But I guess the question really now is, what does all of this mean for investors? Because you've got the UK kind of moving forward with some parts, and you're saying that, and I think the EU used to be a leader. Maybe at the moment people are waiting to see if the dust settles before we decide whether it's still a leader on sustainable finance. I think that's fair to say. The UK is certainly positioning itself. I know Canada is pushing very hard on transition plans, and if we have time, we can talk about Canada's desire to fill the vacuum for leadership on mandating transition plans. But if you're an investor, and this is a question for all of you, but what is this, maybe we'll start with you, Martin, but what does this mean for investors, this kind of domino or interlinked change in regulatory sentiment?
Well, yeah, what is important for investors is not just the disclosure and the reporting regime, right? What is important for investors is also the real economy incentives and the investment opportunities. I guess the headline was not just greening the finance, but financing the green, right? And we talked earlier about this kind of EU journey over the last 5 or 6 years, from the climate target, from the climate law to the competitiveness agenda. Then we have the omnibus and the clean industrial deal. Now we're at the 2040 climate target, and there's lots of other things going on as well, right? But the question is, okay, so how to translate this from the legislative level all the way from the EU to the member states, to actually the private sector and the investor level, what they actually need, right? So, yeah, so at PRI, we are in this project right now, and we are preparing a transition policy brief on making the transition investable. And we talk to our signatories and see what the priorities for them are for the transition, how to make it more investable, what they would actually need, which goes beyond, obviously, a disclosure and reporting, which can only be helpful for transparency and data needs, but is not the main push for investments itself. So some of the answers are that the main thing is regulatory certainty, to understand what kind of laws are coming. The Clean Industrial Deal has a lot of good ideas, a lot of valuable plans that generally investors welcome, but it's not clear how, in what form, and by what timeline they would be implemented. As according to the CID, all of the entire package would be implemented within 2 years, including a lot of different legislation, from a Circular Economy Act to a hydrogen bank to demand and new procurement guidelines, creating demand markets to actually create demand for clean tech. All of these are great ideas, but it's not completely clear for investors what the timeline and the certainty for implementation is, specifically given the backlash right now and looking at what has happened to this really comprehensive sustainable finance framework that has been decided, that has had the impact assessments, that is ready to go forward, and in some respects has gone forward, but now is being pulled back, which leaves investors with, well, we are prepared for this. What does this mean going forward? We will actually be careful, just like was talked about in the other markets as well. And I think some of the things next to this regulatory certainty, or some of the things that came out in the interviews and the surveys that we did, was that national transition plans are important. But national transition plans, I talked about NECPs earlier. This is a mandatory national transition plan for EU countries. Maybe it could be a national energy and climate investment plan, right? So the investment component in these plans is not as strong as it could be, given the need for example, including sectoral decarbonization roadmaps, to look at technology pathways, to look at infrastructure needs, and then in these investment plans, including data on, well, not just the investment needs with milestones, but also what kind of public sector, public finance allocation would be in there, where there are financing gaps, what kind of private sector investments are needed, for which technologies and which infrastructure investment plans in which sector, to just give some kind of idea on where the journey is going and what kind of long-term investment decisions you would want to prepare for, right? One investor said, well, if I have to decide on a project, right, considering project pipeline, I would like to know what is the feasibility, profitability of this project, this long-term investment in 5 to 10 years. Sure. So any kind of government, public information that would help to understand where the market is going and what regulatory incentives or disincentives would be there would actually help with this kind of journey forward and investor needs. And finally, in the survey, the main two factors that were mentioned was the regulatory certainty and the 2040 target, and also like a stronger focus on social and nature aspects. So the Clean Industrial Deal is not very strong on environmental issues, on nature, also given the fact that land use is also important for carbon sinks, and without carbon sinks, without removing carbon, you won't be able to actually reach those climate targets that you actually have committed to. So we could talk a lot about how nature and climate are inextricably linked, right? But these two factors were at the top, and other factors are also important. The financial enabling environment, de-risking mechanisms, kind of a help to take some risks going forward for innovation, for circular economy, also for these clean tech solutions. And also in there is the omnibus itself, because a lot of investors have told us and have actually publicly also stated with PRI and other organizations that they do need this certainty and also the transparency and availability of data for the investments. And the transparency and availability for investments is something that the omnibus helps with. I don't want to say the omnibus, but the legislative files that actually have been together and now have this omnibus frame or tag on it. For example, the Clean Industrial Deal does not mention the taxonomy. It would actually be helpful to have kind of a classification, what is a sustainable activity that you can invest in and what isn't, right? So that would actually be helpful to create this transparency. And for investors, this kind of transparency and this kind of data availability next to all the other economic incentives is really important.
Okay, fab. Oh, we've got a hand up. Yeah? Is there a mic somewhere? Oh, there's two hands up. Oh, there's two. Yeah, both of you, one after the other if you want. Could you introduce yourself just so that we know who you are?
Thomas from CISL at Cambridge. I guess my question is, it would feel a lot, we've put a lot of effort into disclosures, it would feel a lot simpler, at least in theory, just to put a financial incentive, tax for doing bad things, an incentive, positive incentive for doing good things, and very quickly people would feed that through the financial systems and work that way around rather than start with the disclosures and everybody feeling really lost because they've got to make really difficult decisions with really big trade-offs, focusing on impact and not issues which are financially material. Do you not think we should put a bit more effort into actually getting the market incentives right, and what would be the role then of an investor community, given that has to happen in a democratically elected process? What is the role then of investor community in trying to incentivize shifts in markets more broadly, rather than just focusing on shifting individual companies, getting them to do transition plans in a market where those business models probably won't stack up with the current market incentives?
Okay, so the incentives problem, can we use interventions? Could you want to ask was there another question?
Thank you. Brief thank you to all of you, because I think 15 years ago I was in a university in an undergrad where there wasn't even a course on sustainability. So we have gone a long way, and I think you are working in the trenches, and it's not that easy, and it's not always a full house, and we need to acknowledge that, and I think we are all working together in this. So one question that I have to you is, we need to think about when we look at the different standards of the ISSB, the GRI, other more domain-specific standards like the SBTi, they all have an assumption of what the users of those standards need. They all have also a lack of evidence what the users need. And I think that's what you are, from the UNPRI are going into, right? How you engage with your signatories. What are the actual needs that decision makers in your field need? So I wanted to ask each one of you, how do you engage with the users of those standards? How do you make, through guidance, through education, through lots of different ways of engaging with those users, how do you make that type of standards and guidance more user-friendly? It's a big question, but I think it's an important one that we need to answer.
Okay, so they are vaguely related in that we're talking about how you actually get this right, both in terms of disclosures and then about can we go beyond disclosures into incentives. They are big questions. I'm conscious of time, but James, do you want to...
Yeah, sure. So I'll give it a go, particularly Thomas's question. I think what's happened, so at a bigger level than just carbon taxes, but I agree with you that there is a need to just put in markets and taxes into this stuff. And the sustainable investors, or investors more generally, are thinking about ESG risk, and one of the core ESG risks historically has been policy risk, and the problem is that that doesn't actually look like a very big risk at the moment. And so how do we incentivize people to think about the investment risks when policy risk is not as substantial as it was before? Now we still are seeing obviously litigation risk, consumers turning against products that are high or unsustainable, and sadly increasingly physical risk, if you think about what's happened in the world already this year. And but the policy risk piece is really important. And the challenge we've got, I think, is that policymakers saw that as an industry, and in fact as corporates as well, we signed on to things like GFANs and made commitments at COPs. And there's a hell of a lot of firms and companies that have got now net zero targets and plans and actually doing quite a lot of work on this. And that has led government to basically say, oh yeah, you guys have got this done. We don't need to do anything hard. We can just rely on the private sector and investors to make this all happen. And what unfortunately they hadn't really clocked was the fact is that these targets made by corporates and investors were done on the back of governments making their own sort of show that this is the direction that we're going to go in. And when you have governments, investors and companies all pushing in the same direction, that's when we make progress. As soon as one set of that takes their foot off the gas, and in this case it's governments, who got distracted by the cost of living crisis, by the conflict in Ukraine, by all sorts of other things that are going on, you end up with investors kind of saying, whoa, we've done our bit, now we've been left out in the cold. And actually that's even worse from kind of some of the policy areas that particularly with some of the new technologies that are what I kind of think of it as a chicken and egg problem. So electric vehicles is a classic example. No one's going to buy an electric car if you can't charge it anywhere. So, but equally, no one's going to build a network of electric chargers over the entire country if no one has an electric car. So somewhere in the middle, you need government to try and sort of set that whole thing in motion. And there's a number of examples of that. Hydrogen, the hydrogen economy is really interesting as well for that. CCUS, another example. And so a lot of these big parts of the economy that we need to see developing and moving, and we need a lot of private investment into, government's not quite stepping up, and I think needs to step up, and actually everybody's going to have to do hard stuff, and for governments don't like doing hard stuff, tends to get them unelected, and so we've got to also figure out ways of helping governments that want to do good things on climate. Just thinking even of the political environment right here in the UK right now, that we've got to find ways of saying governments that want to do stuff on climate, that's a good thing, that's what we want to see, that's what investors actually also want to see, because that creates the stable future operating environment for financial services. And so, you know, understanding what the future's looking like, understanding where there are opportunities. And then one kind of other example is for sort of highly emitting industries that do have sort of roots to transition, so kind of steel making and concrete manufacturing and other things like that. Even if those companies themselves wanted to transition rapidly right now, finding and raising the capital to do that in the absence of any kind of green premium or other things is quite difficult. So we've got to, again, there's a role for government to either step in the middle. Now, in the US, the government put in the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, RIP, it was a very good piece of made amazing things happen. Bloody expensive, and most other countries couldn't do that. So I had repeated arguments from ministers here in the UK who would say, we can't do the Inflation Reduction Act or respond to the Inflation Reduction because we've got no money. And I said, you're forgetting other bits and pieces of levers that government can pull. Government can put in more taxes, government can put in regulation, government can put in rules that say, actually, if you want to sell concrete or steel in the UK, this is how you need to manufacture it, or this. And we give you a 10-year roadmap, a 10-year pathway. If everybody believes that that's going to stick, that's going to land and stay the test of time, then suddenly you change that risk equation for investors. The risk of doing it goes to the risk of not doing it. And that's the sort of pieces of policy that we need to put in place. And so, you know, one of the things we do quite a lot is try and work with government to unpick and understand what bits of regulation would really shift the dial in terms of getting private capital flowing. Final thing to say, I think, is that what is exciting, though, with where we've got to on sustainable finance is that if you're a project developer, one of your big terrors that keeps you up at night is the idea you might do all this work, get all your permissions, get everything all lined up in order, and then nobody wants to finance your project. I think with sustainable projects, because of where we are with sustainable finance, we're in a position where there is a lot of capital that wants to move into things that are sustainable because they are seen as being part of the economy of the future. They are seen as being things government supports and seen as being things that can stand the test of time. That means if you're a project developer in these spaces, it is a lot, you remove one of your core risk factors of not being able to capitalize it at the end. Okay,
so thoughtful real economy policy, but still a room for disclosures. Bob, you're our resident asset allocator. The second question in particular around how you make sure that data is actually worth having.
Yeah, so I think that around clarity and commons, so all the things that were said, so maybe I'll just, what's additive to this. So I was involved with SASB, so the predecessor to ISSB S1. And, I was chairing their investor advisory group. It was the easiest group to get members to participate on ever, because all investors want better data. And they signed on to that particular initiative because they actually took on a lot of effort, and we would coordinate the specialists from our investment teams. And SASB talked to the investors, and they also talked to the corporates when you look at S1. And it's typically and they went by sector because we said it's very different by sector, and it's 17 to 13 metrics by sector. So it's not huge. I think that the challenge is it comes all together with a whole bunch of other things. And I think there's also this impression that, it's going to be right the very first time. So part of my career, I probably spent 15 years as a chief risk officer. I put in 3 risk systems in my life. The first one looked incredibly basic and different than that last one. And the last one came after the global financial crisis when the FSB mandated all these things in disclosures, which made data available, made people invest in the tools, made things that we could buy off the shelf. And the first one was useful and directional. I would say the last one was actually used by portfolio managers to make investment decisions. And that's when we thought, okay, we finally did it. right? We're getting in risk into their decision. So to think you're going to get it right the very first time until it's used and practiced and inputted, I think that's a naive stance, and people have to appreciate that it's going to evolve and may take a decade. And if you've seen the transition on the risk side, how market risk was measured at the beginning to how it's done today, it's kind of this similar path, and we're just at the start with that disclosure. So I would say right now it's directional and useful. We're not at the point where it's totally getting embedded into investment decisions. But unless you go through this stage, you are not going to get through this stage. And I think the only other thing I would say from being an asset allocator, so I was at a big plan that had direct investing as well as managers, but a lot of direct investing, multiple offices around the world, to a mid-size where we actually work through external managers a lot more, but still do co-investments, and I still have a team that goes out and finds them. But I also chair a foundation's investment committee, which is even smaller, where then you're dependent on consultants and advisors. And so I would note that investors come in different sizes, and they have different level of capabilities, usually correlated with the asset side, but not only. And so unless you start getting this data out there, used by the asset manager community, implemented into their decision-making, starting them to use it, you're never going to get to this point that I think what you were talking about. And so we actually spend a lot of time engaging with asset managers, because that's primarily how a lot of the investment community invests through. So people always talk about big, sophisticated investors. Most do not have the luxury of those teams. And if you have a complicated policy environment, you actually really need people who are into the weeds, sector specialists. And so you just can see the costs going up and up. But if you make the data available, it helps bring down the costs, it makes it a lot more efficient. One thing you talked about, Article 9. We see Article 9, it's like, oh, okay, we can spend less money on that piece of due diligence and spend the money on this piece of due diligence. So I think, we have to get to the point where we actually have to just put this into use it for a decade, modify as we go, and it's going to become where now risk analysis is today for market liquidity and counterparty, right? So I would just say right now, it's policy uncertainty is the easiest thing if you want a deal not done, right? I've been in investment committees for about 30 years now. That is the easiest thing to kill a deal or make the price less attractive. And so to all these governments, figure out how to work with your biggest investors, figure out blended finance, figure out the pieces. But unfortunately, as you correctly noted, they're worried about Trump. They're worried about so many other things. They have mess-ups like a C-59, which in the right intent, but the wrong orders. And we just need to start getting back to how do we put the right foundations in place.
Okay, so we have a question from Khaled. I'm conscious of time. I'm not sure. Is Johnny here somewhere? Is there somebody who can... Johnny, how long have we got? Are we supposed to finish now? I can see a hand, but not... Yeah. Khaled, one question, and then we're going to do 1 minute answers, and then we're going to stop.
Just a quick one, yeah. I'm really interested in kind of the implications of EU deregulation on emerging markets, so across supply chains. So over the past few years, anticipation over the introduction of the CSRD, CSDDD has caused a lot of, particularly in Asia, a lot of regulators and kind of various private market initiatives create initiatives to compile company disclosures or to make disclosures easier for some of these smaller companies. The deregulation is putting a stop to all of that, seeing a lot of momentum sort of slowly wind down. Is the implications of the deregulation across the supply chains, is that something that's figuring into conversations among policymakers? Is that being talked about at all? Is that something that the panelists are worried about?
James, I'm going to ask you to answer that one. Are your members concerned about this? Do you hear that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of disappointment because I think people have actually spent a lot of time making systems and developing things. And, when people say regulation costs money, it does cost money. And what we're seeing in sustainable finance in particular is, because actually financial services firms are caught by this regulation in the same way or incorporated into it. And they've created teams of people, they've brought on consultants, they've done a lot of work to get ready for a lot of this regs, and then it's all changing. And I think that, again, is just things that undermine confidence in whether this is actually going to happen and whether whether it's a tick box exercise or whether it's genuine. And someone earlier talked about the users of data, and I was on a working group of the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK called Users and Preparers, and it really annoyed me, the title of it, because in my mind, for certainly a transition plan, and actually for a lot of other climate sustainability data, the user actually also should be the same person as the, or same thing as the preparer. The company itself is making a transition plan for itself, understanding its transition risk, climate risks, nature risks for itself, so that it can be a better company and be more prosperous and successful, rather than assuming that the user is actually some faraway investor that may or may not look at it. And so I think the sad thing about this is people say, well, we're just doing this as tick box. We'll just have to tick whatever boxes we asked to tick now, and then we'll move on and not think about it again. The whole point of the system is that it's designed to be useful and for those companies. And why do we want that? Like, from a growth and competitiveness perspective, we actually partly want that because the only companies that are going to really survive this transition are companies that are thinking about it and doing something about it and creating and shifting the way that they work to be effective and successful under a transition scenario.
Okay, right. Well, I would love to take more questions. I'm sorry that we're out of time. Our panel's a little bit shorter than some of the others. But the top question we had, EU Omnibus, what does it mean for the EU deregulation? What does it mean for sustainable finance? I think my general conclusion is not as much as people may think it means, that there are signs of hope. There's a lot to play for. The most important thing is stability right now and not destabilizing the kind of conversation, but also there is now a real serious set of thoughts about maybe the right policies are real economy policies, industrial policies, interventions there, and that disclosure takes time and it should not be abandoned just because it doesn't work in the first round of attempts. Thank you hugely